So today I'm going to be talking about doing a deep dive into creating a basic application with the Globus JavaScript SDK. My name is Joe. I am I lead the web team here at Globus. And so today, if you watched the previous video or if you were with us during that presentation, we sort of did a high level overview of JavaScript SDK. And so today, we're going to actually build an application with it, talk a little bit about the different capabilities that it has currently, and talk a little bit about the future. And so the best way I think we can do this together is basically start from a small request. So this might be something you have received. This might be something you are thinking about doing on your own. But let's just say we were requested to create a small web page that allows folks to list the directory contents of the Globus collection. So using that premise, we can sort of pull out a couple of requirements based on that request. And the more obvious requirements would be that we need to create something that's web accessible. We're going to create something that uses a Globus collection UID and a directory potentially. And we're going to interact with some Globus APIs. Maybe some of the less obvious requirements there that are drawn based on that request is that we actually need to register an application with Globus. And we're going to run through this of how to do this. We need to authenticate with Globus. And then we also need to handle some error states returned from the directory listing. And those last couple of requirements are usually the hardest things or the most hidden things when you're starting out interacting with the platform. And so what I'm going to try to do is make sure to highlight those, see how you can use the SDK to simplify those things for you. And so where we're going to start is by just looking at the SDK itself, and we'll start building up the application that lists the directory contents for a collection that we have. And to do this, the best way is kind of for us to just jump into the code a bit and start building the actual application. So I'm going to switch over first to my editor here. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just take a look at the JavaScript SDK. So obviously it's available on GitHub, open source, all the information you need to use the SDK are available in GitHub. And the first thing we're going to do is make sure we include the actual SDK itself into our application. And to do this, since I'm going to be creating a solution for the browser, I'm just going to be using the UMD package. We do distribute other package types. So if you're using like a translation step, or if you're using a bundler like Webpack, you can use these other packages that would probably better fit your use case. But for our demo purposes, we're just going to use the UMD script, and we're going to actually use a version of the SDK that's hosted on a CDN. I've already copy pasted this in here, and I actually also have added some Tailwind styles so we can add some styling to our application kind of as we go. So now that I have the Globus SDK loaded into my HTML file here, I'm actually just going to serve it just so we can take a look to see, what do we have to start with. So I'm just using a command to serve this locally just so we can see how the SDK loads into the environment. And I'm going to pull up the console here and we'll just take a look. And so when we include the Globus SDK into the browser environment, it's going to, using the UMD module, it's going to export a Globus variable. And so the Globus module itself has everything we need to actually interact with the SDK. Now, the first question might be kind of, how do I find out more about what does the Globus SDK offer? I see, this Globus global and these different properties that might look familiar, but what's actually available to me? So one of the best places to go for that information is to go to our type doc generated documentation. So this type doc generated documentation contains all the information that you would need to effectively find a function that meets the requirements for your application. And so it's organized based on the different modules that are exported from the SDK itself. And we name our modules based off our services. So in our use case, we want to interact with transfer. We know we want to interact with transfer because we want to do a file operation. We want to list information on directory contents. So I can go to the SDK documentation. I can go into the transfer section, and then I see all the different methods that are available within transfer. The first thing I probably want to do, I know like I want to do a file operation. I want to do an LS to complete this task, but I think maybe to get started, it's going to be easier to try to get an idea of the collection that we're working with. And to do that, I'm going to use the endpoint resource, and I'm going to fetch that resource. So the get method for transfer endpoint get, you'll see has a huge property return value. And this is actually the type that will be returned from the Globus SDK if you're using the TypeScript types. We're not going to be using those today, but we can talk about them more kind of as we go. But basically what this is going to, this object represents is the return value from the method. And you'll see the return values are all promises. So we use fetch under the hood. And what this value here, this data response is the resolve value of the underlying HTTP request. So this get method is used to fetch an endpoint by its UUID. The endpoint nomenclature here is legacy nomenclature that we are moving away from. An endpoint in this case is also, it's a collection. The endpoint terminology is from v4, so the transfer service itself still uses this endpoint, which is why it's still endpoint in the SDK. But the method here is, this get method is what we want to be able to use to actually fetch information about an endpoint. So that's where we're going to kind of start with our app. And so let's just create a script, and we're going to say this is type. And I'm going to go ahead and focus. We're going to call this type text JavaScript. We know we have our Globus global variable. And then I'm going to use transfer endpoint get. And that's the function that I'm going to wind up calling. You'll see the first argument that from the documentation we know is the collection ID that is required. I'm actually just going to grab a collection ID that I know exists, but this could be any collection ID. This might be a collection ID managed by your institution. It might be a collection ID that you set up, so potentially a GCP endpoint. But this UUID is the actual ID of the collection that we're going to be listing directory contents from. So I've gone ahead and added that, and let's just see what happens when I process this on its own. So let's just set this to a variable, and we're going to see what happens here. So switching over to our page, I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. And so by making this call, Globus transfer endpoint get, you'll see in the network tab, it's actually made a request for us. And the request that it's made is the request to fetch the endpoint. We know that we're calling Globus transfer endpoint get, so that's expected. But then you'll see that we're getting a 400 error. And so this starts to go back to the idea that there's potentially some hidden requirements here within that initial request that we need to start poking at and need to start figuring out how we're going to solve. And so if we look at what this 400 error is, it's an authentication failure. And this is likely the first thing you're going to hit integrating with any service within Globus, whether it's transfer, flows, compute. Really, most operations are going to require you to have some user authentication aspect of your application. And so what the SDK offers to simplify this is our authorization manager. And the first step that we need to take to use the authorization manager is to actually register an application. And so to register an application means to create an application within Globus that can be used for your users to log in and allow you to identify those users. So the authorization manager within the SDK needs your application information to be able to authenticate your users. And it also needs some configuration values just to complete the OAuth handshake. So I'm going to actually register a Globus application really quickly live. I've already got a project set up that I'm going to be using. So I've got my demo and presentation project. I'm going to add a new app. When I go to add my application, I'm going to register a thick client or script. And basically what this means is it's just going to be a public OAuth client. In our particular case, it's going to be a client that is a web application. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to call this our basic demo. And then the next important thing that we are going to need to do within our application is configure a redirect. And so because the OAuth handshake is required in order to authenticate with Globus, using this application method, what we need to provide is a redirect URL where our application will actually handle the OAuth handshake. For now, I'm just going to use HTTP. Let's do localhost 1000. So this is the same location that I'm hosting my file. I'm just going to use that. The only way you can use HTTP is if you're using localhost. If you are using any other domain, it's going to have to be a HTTPS. But for the sake of our demo, we'll just use our currently served page. So I'm going to register the app with that redirect because that's where I will be handling it. And then once I register my application, I get a client ID. And so this is the other important piece that I need for our application. So I'm going to copy that, and then I'm just going to put it in our code as a const. There's our client. And now that we have our client ID, we can start actually interacting with the authorization manager. And to do this, like I said, we need these two things, potentially three things. We're gonna include a third. We need a registered application, like we just the client ID that is created when registering the application. We need the route in the application that'll handle the authorization grant flow, which will be our local host 3000 or wherever we're going to host this file, whether that's a web page, a local server, whatever that may be, wherever we can redirect to from the auth service. And then additional scopes required by your application. And so third thing is, again, another point where it's sort of a hidden requirement when this request came up, this idea of I want a page that lists contents of a collection. And so where scopes come into play within the Globus ecosystem, it's all going to depend on what service you're interacting with and what aspects and features you're interacting with as far as the service goes. So in our case, we're going to be interacting with transfer. And so the transfer scope that we actually need and that we care about is a transfer all scope. So let's switch over to our code and start creating a authorization manager. So let's create a manager, and we are going to do Globus authorization create. We're going to pass in an object here of client, and then this is going to be our client ID. We're going to pass in our redirect, which we configured in our Globus application. And that's going to be local host 3000. This should match because it's basically telling the auth service what URL it will redirect to. If that URL doesn't match one of the registered URLs, it will result in an error. And then we're going to include a scope. Our scope, just going to copy from documentation, is our transfer all scope. So configuring a manager in this way really isn't going to do anything beyond setting us up to start the authentication process or the OAuth handshake. I can refresh our page here and we'll see nothing happens beyond that initial request we were already making as far as the error status changing, or even just the application changing at all. So really, we're just setting up the manager to process the OAuth handshake. And so let's talk a little bit about what this OAuth handshake is going to look like and how it's going to be processed. So the OAuth handshake between the public client, which is going to be our application, and Globus Auth. This is the abstract protocol flow from the OAuth spec. We're actually going to wind up using Pixie, which is going to do a code challenge behind the scenes and actually during the handshake. So what this winds up looking like from a call stack perspective is that we're going to use the manager reconfigured to log in. That login request is going to go to Globus Auth. Globus Auth is going to return to our application that redirect URL, where we're going to handle the code redirect. Because we're using Pixie, it's going to use that challenge request. It's going to use the code that's returned from Globus Auth to actually process that request. And it's going to exchange that for a token from Globus Auth. Once we have that token, then we have basically all we need to interact with whatever service we want. So if we were requesting a scope that belonged to flows, we could interact with flows. In our case, we're going to be requesting the scope that belongs to transfer, so we will be able to communicate with transfer. So these are the steps that we're basically looking to accomplish. The important things to note here are after the login, we're going to do a redirect to Globus Auth. Then once the user completes authentication, they're going to be redirected back through our redirect URI. That's when we want to handle the handle code redirect. And then once this handshake is completed, this will automatically talk to Globus Auth, exchange for a token, which will effectively bootstrap our manager instance into an authenticated state where we can then communicate with the services. So let's start coding that up. So the first thing we know we want to do is call manager login. And we know from our configuration and from the diagram we just went through, as soon as we call this, we're going to be redirected to auth. So really, for the sake of this demo, we're going to be creating an application that asks a user to log in as soon as they load the page. In a application environment, a web application, or the context of an existing web application, you're likely doing this on some user-based event. So they're clicking a login button. Maybe you have a button on your page that says authenticate with Globus. That button would likely trigger this login. But for demo purposes and to keep this the actual code we generate pretty concise, we're just going to ask the user to log in on the page. So if I refresh the page now, what we should see here, gotta save that. Should see I'm immediately redirected to Globus Auth. And as soon as I'm redirected here, this is where auth takes over, and it's really just processing the requests that the SDK has generated. And so what to pick out here are the different scopes that the application is actually asking. So if you remember when I registered my application, the name was basic demo. And then if we go back to our scopes, we remember that we requested transfer all. And so here we see, in order to use this application.
Joe, we can't see your browser.
Oh, thank you. Let's switch over. There we go. In order to interact with this application, I'm going to have to interact or approve these different scopes. And so the name of the application that I configured is shown here. The different scopes that I'm requesting are shown here. And so obviously in our case, I've requested transfer all. So the important one that I care about here is the managed data using Globus transfer. These other scopes are scopes that are automatically injected by the SDK that we request on behalf of the requester within the authorization manager. The reason for that is because these are needed to identify your user or a user, regardless of kind of what your application is attempting to accomplish. You can turn these off by sending a flag to the authorization manager, but in most cases, you're going to want this information within your application. Specifically, you're going to want the OpenID information as well as some identity information to be able to get information about that user, be able to do things like show who's logged in within your application. So by default, it simplifies requesting those by adding them, but you can turn them off if you need be. And there are dependent scopes that are created based on these initial scopes that we're requesting. So because we are requesting information about your identity, it is going to be asking information about groups. But again, these are scopes that you likely need for interacting with any Globus service. So having these just be the default makes a lot of sense most of the time. So I can allow this. I'm not going to do it just yet. So if I allowed this, basically what would happen? Let's take a look at the request that was generated here by the actual SDK. If I can find it, here it is. This authorize request. So as soon as I allow this, what's going to happen is it's going to return back to my page, right? The redirect URI that I configured in my app. And so because I'm not doing anything on this page other than asking the user to log in, we're going to be in a bit of an infinite loop where I would hit allow and then we redirect it back to this page. It's going to try to log the user in and then just go to auth, redirect back to the local host. So I'm not going to hit allow just yet, because luckily by not allowing, it's kind of prevented us from getting it into this infinite loop space. But what I am going to do is update the code, because I know when the redirect does occur back to my application, I need to handle that code that's going to be passed. That is effectively the code that I need to communicate with auth again to get a token. So in order to do that, I'm going to call manager handle code redirect. And so what this is going to do is once this page is loaded, it's going to process the URL. And if there's a code in the URL, a code parameter, the SDK is going to take that code parameter and attempt to complete the OAuth handshake and exchange for any tokens that have been requested. So in most cases, when you're writing a real world application, you're likely not doing this on the same route. You're likely not logging in and handling the code redirect on the same exact page. You can, but in most cases, you're likely asking the user to log in on a sign-in page, and then you're handling your code redirect on something like a authorization route. What that does, doing that just helps separate the actual behavior here of the automatic redirect that occurs when you do something like login, and then also the automatic exchange for tokens when there is a code parameter. So we do have to add some extra conditions here, just based on the fact that we're going to be creating a single page, a single HTML page. But if you had an application router, I'd recommend doing this on a separate route, so you don't have to include any sort of conditions. So the condition I'm going to throw in here, just to be safe, basically, is to say we only want to call handle redirect if the manager is not authenticated. So let's say the manager. Oops. And the window.location.href includes and there's included code. So again, this is just being extra safe based on the fact that we're using a single file for this process. I'm also going to wrap our login with a check to say if the user is not logged in, so manager authenticated, not authenticated, and we're going to call login. And this can likely be cleaned up with some refactoring, but I'm just going to leave it a little more verbose for now for the sake of education. So let's go back to our localhost page. And so I've gone back to my localhost page, but it's redirected me because I'm not authenticated. And so now let's allow. So now once I allow, I think I actually might have to clear my cache 1 second here. So the code reuse is, we might have a bug here. Okay. So if my manager is not authenticated and my href includes code, handle code redirect. Looks right to me. Let's see. Oh, excuse me. We want to make sure if we're not authenticated and so, but let's do this. Let's say, I'm actually going to move this to this clause because what's actually happening right now is on initial load, we're not authenticated, but because the code parameter there, it's actually trying to log us in again and it's trying to reuse the state. So I think a better way to express this for the single file page that we want to do is something like this. So basically, if we're not authenticated and we're not about to process the code, then we're going to log in. Otherwise, we're going to handle the code redirect. And let's go back here. Now it might be a bit of an infinite loop based on my session state, but just we can do that. So I'm going to have to go ahead and stop this from redirecting automatically. Clear my session information. So if you saw there, we actually had tokens that were being managed by the application, and we actually have a code verifier and Pixie state in here. So this is a state we've managed to get into where our state isn't being updated, and we need to make sure that we have a clean OAuth handshake. So let me get rid of this or bring this back. And we're not authenticated, manager login. That's spelled authenticated wrong. There we go. Okay. Let's try it again. This is also why I recommend using an environment that's going to give you IntelliSense. I'll show an example of that later, but using just a plain HTML file, you run into a lot of issues like this that are solved by both our types and the documentation within the SDK itself. Spelling being one of the great examples, as well as some of the other the intricacies of the different method signatures and structures. So, but there we go. We are in a good state now. And so now if I look at what's happening, I'm still getting this 400 here because I'm not doing anything with the authentication manager. I'm just authenticating. But if I look at my application tab and I look at my local storage, I will see that I have 2 tokens in my local storage. And so these are the tokens that are just going to be that are managed by the authorization manager itself. And these tokens they represent all of the scopes that we've requested initially. So we've effectively requested tokens for 2 different services. We've requested tokens for the auth service, and we've requested tokens for the transfer service. Now that I have this token, what I'm going to do, and I'm going to switch this to focus for you all. I'm going to make this same request, this Globus transfer request, but I'm going to pass in a header, and I'm going to pass in my authorization. And on the pair token here, I'm going to pass in my manager tokens transfer. So the tokens property on the manager is going to be all the tokens that are registered within the manager at any given time. And then we care about the transfer service, obviously. So we're going to be adding in that transfer token. So let's refresh the page now. Let's see what happens with that request. Oh, transfer. Transfer. Let me double check that.
We lost your browser again too.
Okay. So I am checking out the manager instance, and I'm actually going to make this a var just so we can interact with it in our browser. And so if I go to manager, tokens, we'll see tokens transfer. There's our transfer token, just to make sure we have our access token. There's our access token. So let's just make sure we're copying that same exact property there. Good, bearer.
Is it headers?
Yes, it is. Thank you. And this is authorization. So let's refresh. Sent here. Oh, I don't know. I capitalized the H there, though. Strange. So now we should be sending our header, and we're getting 200 response. So the authorization header being sent or stored within the authorization manager, referencing it via the service that we want to interact with, and using that access token to actually interact with the service. And so let's actually just do a quick little div here. Let's start making something actually show for the work we've been doing. So let's just add an H1, and we're going to call this ID display. So here, rather than setting this response, let's just use the fact that this is the promise that returns a fetch response. We're going to say JSON, and property we just made display, and we will set the text content to the body dot display. So again, this is a scenario where having the TypeScript types would be helpful here, just because we would actually get the full type of what the body is and actually get auto completion on these different values. But using this environment, we're not going to get those. But let's just see how we do there. Okay, perfect. So we've got our we've got something echoing out. We're interacting with a service. So let's just add a quick little style here. Just so we give ourselves some room. And then we want to list the directory contents. So let's create a landing for that. All right, so next steps here. We were interacting with, or we're making a request to Globus Transfer. We're getting information about the collection ID that we're passing here. Now it is time to actually try to list information from this endpoint. And so again, in a normal application, you'd likely have, maybe this isn't happening on the same page. Maybe you're doing this based on user interaction. In our file manager, we do it based on the selection of a collection. But for our case of a demo, I'm going to just load it as soon as we land on the page. And so let's simplify this a little bit. Let's grab our collection ID. Use that to not only fetch the collection, but we're also going to use that as an argument to the ls command. And let's just let this fail again, just so we can see what happens. So I'm going to grab that fetch result, and I'm going to grab the JSON. And then once I have the JSON, I'm going to hopefully grab that body. And then what I want to do is say document that contents. We're going to say contents is going to be text content, and we'll just set this to JSON string by the body. So all we're going to be doing, again, using the fetch response, the JSON function here to return the JSON from the fetch response. Once we have the body, then rendering the JSON to the actual contents div that we made up there. So if I refresh this, we'll see that my failure is very similar to that initial failure to transfer because I am not passing an authorization header. So we know how to fix that by passing in the headers. So these signatures are meant to be very similar. They're meant to be identical. So the idea between what service you're using, what service method you're using, the signatures all stay the same. So if the actual resource requires a path segment, that's going to be the first args, and then the second arg is going to be this options object that where you can pass headers, you can pass get parameters. So if we wanted to do things like filtering, pagination, then you can also pass payload if we're doing requests. So I'm passing in that access token to the second request now. This is what was happening before. Now let's see what happens. So I'm getting a different error. This is where, it's another one of those hidden requirements that you start to see interacting with Globus. This first request here is actually requesting that I can have an additional consent than what I've asked for initially. And so I have two ways I could actually go about fixing this. So you see here this scope string where it says transfer all, and then it includes a scope for data access. I could actually include this in my manager configuration and basically ask for this scope up front, right? So I could change my scope because this is going to be a dependent scope. I could change my requesting scope to this. What would happen here is when people load my app, they'd actually be consenting to both the transfer all and the data access scope to this collection that I configured. But that's a little, if it meets your use case if you are only interacting with one collection. If you want your users to be able to select a collection, or you want to be able to interact with multiple collections, you want to be able to actually address this error dynamically. So that's what we're going to do in our application, because this is another thing that the SDK attempts to simplify for you. So normally what you'd have to do is parse this message, see what required scopes are here, then go back through the OAuth handshake, make sure it's returning back to your application, exchanging the token, all of that. But we provide some utilities to simplify this process. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to create a const value that is error. And then within the SDK, we expose an errors module. And so this errors module, and I realize I'm getting some code cut off. Let me switch over there. This errors module is going to include some properties and methods that just help you identify, what a payload from a service response might be. And so what we're going to check for is whether or not it is the error well form. We're just going to pass it that raw body. And what this method is going to do is look at this shape. So you can pass it anything and it'll try to figure it out. But it'll try to look at the object and determine if it's something that we recognize as officially a well-formed error within Globus. This particular error, we're going to be able to identify by the fact that it has a code and the code is consent required. There's a whole set of errors that are set up to be identified by the SDK, and we're continuing to expand on what errors are identified and how they're processed. But this is probably the most common one that you're going to hit. And so what we want to do once we identify whether or not there is an error is we want the manager to handle the error. So we're just going to call manager handle error response, and we're going to pass in the body. This handle error response does take a second argument of it's a Boolean value, and in the latest version, it can actually be an object that has even more options. But what the values represent is whether or not the error handling automatically executes. Where that comes into play and can be important is if, in this particular case, wherein I'm going to be handling a consent required message, if I want a user to interact with a button before actually addressing this error, or if I want to present an error before this error is handled, I can do that by saying handle error response false. That's going to give me the handler, and then I can call that later in my application processing. But for the sake of demonstration, we're just going to execute the handler right away, so I don't need that second argument. And so now, when I refresh this page, you'll see as soon as that error was hit, so there was a little flash there where we rendered it to the contents div before it was handled, just based on how our application is processing. But once it was processed and we identified it as a well-formed error, handle response actually redirect us to the auth page, which is actually asking for that additional consent. And so now I can allow this. And once I allow this, we actually start to see a response that represents a file response or a directory listing. So let's just clean this up a little bit. Switch this to pre, just because that'll look a little better. And yeah, that's perfect. And so here we have a very, very, very simple application where we've gone from the client ID that we registered, we've gone from the collection ID that we've configured, and we're actually getting information about that collection. We're rendering out the display name, but then we're also listing the directory contents. And so this is where, it's likely just a starting point. Obviously, we probably want to make this pretty and do some changes as far as how this is rendered. Maybe we want to do traversal within directories, but you can start to see kind of how the interaction with these services come together and how the SDK simplifies it. So just a little bit of a quick recap as far as what we built and kind of what recommendations of how to use the things that we were interacting with today. Use the authorization manager to reduce boilerplate in the browser specifically. So one of the things we didn't talk about today was the fact that you can use the SDK in other runtime environments. So you can use the SDK within Node, Bun, There, the authorization management is on your own because you are likely using a secret or you're using something that is getting your token by some other means. So what we covered today was specific to the browser. The authorization manager and its current status is specific to the browser, but it is something we are looking at. How do we expand, simplify for those scripting use cases? I highly recommend using an ID that will support IntelliSense. You saw my misspelling error that caused an infinite redirect. Don't do that. Use an editor that's going to give you some helpful feedback. Use TypeScript to take that even a step further to be able to better identify where properties are, what properties are available based on the service method you're using. And then I really want to highlight the fact that while today we were using transfer, the same principles of interacting with the authorization manager, the interacting with services, all apply to the different services as well. So if you want to get a token for flows and then make a request to the flows service, it's very similar to what we did today. This example that I actually went through is a very primitive version of what we call our basic example that we have in our repo. The example there has a sign in, sign out button. So maybe like a next steps here. And it also is a little bit nicer of a rendering, but the general concepts are there. You can take that example and basically swap out the collection ID, swap out the client ID, your registered Globus application with something you register, and it should just work out of the box. But keep following that area of the SDK for more examples, more in-depth examples. We do have some examples in there using React, TypeScript that are definitely more advanced, but it's seeing how the SDK can be used in a larger application for sure. And I believe that is all I have today.